Will Fenton, Director of Research and Public Programs at the Library Company of Philadelphia. I suspect that many of you know the Library Company, but the sort of shortest version I can give you is that we were founded by Benjamin Franklin in 1731 as the first subscription library in America. And over the past, 300 odd years, we've changed a little bit. And now we're a research library, and we support all sorts of terrific researchers like some of the folks we're going to hear from today. This is a fireside chat. It is intended to be a weekly webinar series. We're very grateful to our scholarly community for sustaining this. It's a webinar, so this is all happening through Zoom. As I mentioned earlier, this is a particular flavor of Zoom. Your camera is not enabled, so you can put your feet up and relax. We encourage people to have a nice glass of wine or something, or Perrier if that's your thing. Of course, to submit your questions, we have a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. So if you cursor down to the bottom of your screen, you'll see Q&A, and that's how we encourage you to submit questions as you're hearing what promises to be an excellent, thoughtful talk. I will do my best to get us through all those questions. I'll be mediating them at the very end, but if we don't get to things, we'll make sure that we follow up with you. And of course, we always follow up with folks within a week of these talks with any session notes. So if there are any great links or resources that come up in the course of the conversation, I'll make sure that those get enclosed with the email, as well as durable versions of this. So you'll have a link to the video recording on YouTube, which you can share with any friends and family that maybe couldn't make it on a Thursday night. We also put this out through our SoundCloud, which means it goes out to our podcast feed. So if you're a podcast listener, wherever you listen to your podcast, Talking in the Library is now our platform for our Fireside Chat series. Finally, if you don't already, please subscribe to our email list, because that's how you find out about all the great things we're doing at the Library Company. That's a lot more than just Fireside Chats. So if you haven't already, submit your email on librarycompany.org. You can put your email address in there, and then we'll send you a discrete amount of email. All right. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce not one, but two Fireside presenters. First, we have Kayla Anthony, who serves as the Executive Director of the Philadelphia Society for the Preservation of Landmarks, Phila-Landmarks, and she's currently in her second year. For 89 years, Phila-Landmarks has played a significant role in the historic preservation movement in Philadelphia by restoring, furnishing, and presenting to the public its distinguished house museums. Those house museums include the Powell House, Grimblethorpe, Hill Physic House, and historic Waynesboro. Previous to this position, Ms. Anthony served as Phila-Landmark's Development and Programs Manager, where she honed her vision to focus the organization on programmatic community engagement and contributed revenue development. She also served as the Resident Site Manager of the Hill Physic House, graduating summa cum laude with a BA in French and a BA in Theater Arts from Indiana University of Pennsylvania. She brings a diverse, creative background to the organization, along with a keen understanding of strategic partnerships and networking. Our second presenter is Samantha Snyder, the reference librarian at the Washington Library at George Washington's Mount Vernon. She has an upcoming chapter on Elizabeth Powell in the edited volume, Women in the World of Washington, set to be published by the University of Virginia Press in early 2021. Congratulations. She is also currently working on a longer biography of Elizabeth Powell. She earned her master's in Library and Information Studies and BA in English Literature from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And she is currently pursuing a master's in history at George Mason with a focus on early American women's history. Welcome both.
Thank you. We will share our screen, but thank you so much, Will, and thank you to the Library Company. We're thrilled to be here today, talking about a subject that we're obviously both very passionate about. We thought, when he first approached me about doing a fireside chat for the Library Company about Elizabeth, the first thing that came to my mind was, of course, bringing Sam into the dialogue. Sam is now what we would probably consider the expert on Elizabeth Powell, and she's been researching her for about 2 years now. And Sam has put together in this presentation a really lovely display of source materials that were actually from the Library Company, because her research has been knee-deep in HSP LC, the library company, and our own account books. And we thought that it might be really lovely to kind of talk about like why both of us and what is our relationship to Elizabeth Powell. And for me personally, well, we'll move on to the next slide.
Yes.
Who was Elizabeth William Powell, and who
was she to us?
Exactly. So my first day at Phil Landmarks was a very eventful day. It doesn't happen all that often in our organization, but we received a very generous loan from a Powell descendant who had gifted us with an account book set of Elizabeth's, and these accounts were almost about to be thrown out. So they were cleaning out a storage unit, and they were found in a trunk, and there was a false bottom in the trunk, and the descendant's husband noticed the false bottom and was like, we have to, what is this? He pulled it out, and he saw these account books, and then they brought them to us. And so my first day of work at Phil Landmarks, I got to do a deep dive right into Elizabeth Powell. So the most exciting part about that week, actually, and some of you may already know this story who's on the seminar tonight, but the most exciting moment was when a couple of my colleagues and I come upstairs to look at the library. So the Powell House has about a fourth of the Powell's library, and just for reference, we are in the Powell House tonight. This is the mantle, and Our Lady is with us this evening. But we came into this very room to look at the library, and we just thought, I wonder which books were hers. Like, are there any books here on this shelf that are hers? And a colleague pulled off a book, and it was called The British Spy, and it is a fiction book. But we looked at it, and I said, I know we saw accounts of her buying books downstairs in these account books. Let's see if we have any of them. And I went downstairs, and not but 15 minutes later, did I turn to a page that said at the very top a book called The British Spy for $1 in these account books. And you can see on the right here, that is the title page where Elizabeth inscribed her name. So from that moment on, I was enamored with Elizabeth. And it was, I don't know if any day at Phil Landmarks is quite compared to that one, but I do love the organization, and it's been an amazing time here.
Yes.
Sam, what turned you on to Elizabeth Powell?
Well, so as Will said, I work at George Washington's Mount Vernon, and I started there January of 2017. And we do a lot of tours at the library because we have a beautiful space, and we have some highlights that we usually pull. And we actually have this letter that we pull quite frequently, that when I first started, I saw that it was from a woman named Elizabeth Willing Powell. And I'm like, who is this woman? But what I first noticed about this letter is that it was written on my mom's birthday. And I know my mom is watching, so hi Mom, I'm gonna tell the birthday story. So I thought, how cool is that? But then I started to learn more about the letter, and the letter was from this very powerful woman who wrote to George Washington on the subject of his resignation for being president of the United States. And I thought, wow, this woman sounds really interesting. And then I started learning more about her. We actually are lucky enough to have a large collection of the Powell letters at Mount Vernon because she and her husband and the Washingtons were very good friends. So through a Powell descendant, we also have some letters. And so I started looking more into those letters, and then it just kind of spun from there. And I was introduced to the fine people at Landmarks, and it's just all kind of gone from there. So it's been a journey so far.
What's really exciting about the account books that we have is that Sam's probably the first person, well, she is the first person who truly has gone through it and will be incorporating the new findings of these account books in her research. So it's very exciting, and it's a look into Elizabeth's life much later in her life than we're used to focusing on, which we'll talk about a little bit today.
Yeah.
So I guess we should move on to who is Elizabeth Powell and what was her early life like?
So I guess I'll start. So Elizabeth Powell, she was a young woman in Philadelphia. She was born in 1742 and actually lived until 1830. So she was almost 88 when she died. So that'll just kind of give you think about that as we go on, just how long her life was. But she was born to two prominent Philadelphian families, the Willings and the Shippens. And you might recognize the Shippen name from Peggy Shippen Arnold from Turn, Benedict Arnold's wife, who was also a lot more than just Benedict Arnold's wife. But those two families, they got married, Charles Willing and Anne Shippen, and had 10 children. And Elizabeth was one of those children, right in the middle of them. So there's not a lot of primary source evidence from that point in her life, but we can kind of infer based on scholarship of the period that as a wealthy young woman, she would have received quite an education. So that kind of was the basis of the start of her life. She was very consistently into education her whole life, very well read. She would have been learning how to dance, geography, history, the sciences, all sorts of things. So she really was an interesting young woman. And the images that we've included on the screen, the image on the left is the Willing home. So that's her childhood home. And it actually sat just down the block from where the Powell house is now. It was torn down 2 weeks after that picture was taken. And I don't know if you can see the little credit line, but that is actually an image that's at the Library Company of Philadelphia. So that just kind of shows the wealth she was born into, having a large house like that sort of.
And 3rd Street and 4th Street right over, this was really the epicenter of Philadelphia's social life.
Yeah.
So where she was living was actually very relevant
central
to the fact that she, would be brought up in these social circles that would afford her the opportunity to move in their circles that she ended up moving in.
And then this miniature in the middle is a miniature that's actually here in this room, actually. And it's by an unknown artist, but it's Elizabeth Willing circa late 1750s, 1760s. So again, kind of a sign of her status that she would have had a miniature painted. And we don't know who it was given to. It could have been Samuel Powell, could have been a family member, we don't know. But then the image on the right is just kind of meant to show her lifelong love of reading. That's a list of books in her almanac that says a list of novels I think well worth purchasing. And I don't know if she had checked them out at the library previously, because she did have a membership to the Phillips Circulating Library. So she was coming up with some ideas before finally making the purchase. So that's kind of early Elizabeth.
And education was really a major focus of her life throughout her life. So while, of course, it started in her youth, she was very well educated throughout her life and very passionate about it, as you can see from this inscription that was done for her from Benjamin Rush. Sam, would you like to talk a little bit about this?
So people watching may recognize the name Benjamin Rush. He was a big deal in Philadelphia, really an institution in Philadelphia. He was a medical professional. He was a member, he was an advocate for women's education, abolition, but specifically for this, he was an advocate of women's education. And actually he published this pamphlet. It was originally a speech, and he published a pamphlet and dedicated it to Mrs. Elizabeth Powell. He knew that the subject of the pamphlet and the idea of women's education was somewhat prejudiced. So he wanted to use her name to make sure that people understood that this was a legitimate, respectable thing, and her name held a lot of weight. So this quote in the middle was actually a letter from her that is in the Library Company papers, in the Rush papers, written to him in 1795. So shortly after her husband died, someone approached her with asking her about what they should do for their own daughter's education. And Elizabeth decided that this pamphlet would be what she should give that person. And so she couldn't find it within their library. She couldn't figure out where it was. So she writes Benjamin Rush and says a very funny thing about, I well recollect that you did me the honor to present me with a number of copies of your excellent treatise of education. The work entirely met my ideas on that interesting subject that I dispersed them with avidity. So she clearly she gave them all out. Her husband had her keep one, but then she couldn't find it. So it's just very interesting that she clearly supported this and supported women's education. So
and did throughout
her life. Yeah.
So this is really the groundwork for what allowed her to sort of move into the next phase of her life, which was a very social and political phase of her life. So this, of course, is a William Birch print, and this is a 3rd Street, which is where we are today, and Spruce Street. The building on the corner there is the Bingham Mansion, which was her relative.
William Bingham. William and Anne Bingham. Yeah, Anne Bingham was her niece. So yes.
And then you can see in the far distance there is the Powell house in the distance. So Elizabeth, obviously coming from a really important social circle here in Philadelphia, becomes of age, and it is that marrying time, and we're really not sure exactly how Samuel and Elizabeth met. We can't quite pinpoint that, but we do know that they would have probably had knowledge of each other given Philadelphia's
pretty small social circles.
Exactly. Yeah. But Samuel also came from a wealthy family. He inherited his grandfather's fortune at a very young age. His grandfather was a carpenter, and he owned a lot of property in Philadelphia. And Samuel went on a very long tour of Europe, which was not uncommon for the time, but it was the length of his
twice
tour
as long as it was.
was much longer than most gentlemen at the time spent in Europe. So he was there for 7 years, and he rubbed elbows with a lot of enlightened thinkers while he was abroad, like Voltaire and the Pope. We assume he had a very lovely time abroad, and he came back, as he was a Quaker, he came back an Anglican, which we do think was probably a strategic move, because this afforded him the opportunity to begin his political career. So again, as we mentioned, we don't really know exactly when these two would have met, but these two don't have any letters that actually survive between the two of them, because they really weren't apart all that often. And so all we know really truly about their relationship is coming through the eyes of others who wrote about them. And the Marquis de Châteaulieu, who clearly was very enamored with Elizabeth as well, not in that way, but enamored with her to write enough about her, makes this really lovely comment on the equality and the mutual respect of their relationship. He says, "Indeed, it would be difficult to separate them from each other, 2 persons for who 20 years have lived together in the sweetest union. I shall not say as man and wife, which would not convey the idea of perfect equality in America, but as 2 friends happily matched in point of understanding, taste, and information." And it's really just really lovely to see that it was obvious to the people that they were entertaining here at the Powell house, that sort of mutual respect that existed between these two.
Yeah, I agree. It definitely gives you a glimpse into how they operated as a couple, but also how they operated their parties and their salons. So I think next we kind of want to talk about the entertainment and the house.
So they were married August 7th, I believe, 1769. And just before that, they purchased this lovely house on 3rd Street, 244 South 3rd Street. Come visit us at the Powell house. But they purchased it on August 2nd. Samuel purchased it from Charles Stedman. This is from his account books, which is also in the Library Company collection. And Charles Stedman was a merchant and a shipmaster. He went bankrupt shortly after they broke ground on this house. And I'm not even sure that he ever truly lived here.
I don't think he did.
I don't think he did either. But it was put on the market, and shortly thereafter it was purchased by Samuel, and he and Elizabeth moved in shortly after their marriage. Because I guess Samuel had experienced all these lavish tastes abroad in Europe, he decided to do a little renovation on the house, and he employed Robert Smith as a builder and architect to do some of the beautiful rococo ceiling and moldings that are in the room behind us in the ballroom. But he also furnished the house in the finest European tastes, which you can see again from the Marquis de Châteaulieu's comment here, where he says that Elizabeth received me in a beautiful English home, adorned with beautiful prints and very good copies of the best paintings in Italy. So he was trying to really bring his experience back to Philadelphia with him. And it was somewhat unusual to have such a European-inspired home, I feel like, in Philadelphia.
Yeah, and they were definitely setting the stage for themselves. They were creating this home to be their stage for entertainment.
Absolutely.
And really building the network that they had brought together from their separate lives into one. And they really, by the mid-1770s, made their home the social center of the Philadelphia scene.
Yes.
So they had a ballroom, which is
right behind us.
Yes, which is in the room behind us, or the room behind us. But it's also the room in this picture.
Yes, and so this picture is from the Philadelphia Museum of Art. You are reading that correctly. The original woodwork was taken out of the room in the early 20th century and installed in the Museum of Art. And it is unfortunate, but it is a good thing that it is being there and well preserved, and it allowed us to restore the room behind us to its current standard right now when the house became a house museum in the 30s. So it was a great frame of reference for us, and we are fortunate that this also still exists at the Museum of Art. But this is where the epicenter of the entertainment is happening.
Yes.
So in many lavish parties were happening here. John Adams himself mentions the most sinful feast again at the Powell's, talking about how much he ate and drank and how much they enjoyed his stay there. And this really amazing quote from Anne Shippen Livingston that Sam points out here talks a lot about, like, the kind of images you would see. What kind of what do these parties look like, Sam? What were these people wearing?
Exactly. So they were wearing French hats with 5 white plumes nodding in different ways. So just really opulent dress for an opulent party. They were really
meant to be seen, meant to show their status in the world. Anne Shippen Livingston was one of Elizabeth Powell's relatives, I think a niece. So she went to Mrs. Powell's, which we see quite frequently, that it was often Elizabeth that was the one reference. Wasn't Samuel's being
it was Mrs.
Dined
Powell's.
at Mrs. Powell's.
So yeah, it's just a really interesting example from kind of the slope upwards of their life as the social scene of Philadelphia. This is from 1783. So it's just a really interesting little quote.
Yeah. So that moves us on into the salons. And so in addition to entertaining, the Powells weren't just having a good time amongst their friends. It was very much so a strategic social and political move to hold these salons. And Elizabeth was absolutely 100% an active participant.
Oh, yes.
It's very clear based on others writing of her how outspoken and intellectual and how much of a conversationalist she was. So she was absolutely driving these conversations and with very important political men. So she was an active participant in this, which was, I won't say is completely uncommon for the time. Well, but maybe not quite as outspoken as she clearly was.
And the role that she would have played as the hostess of the salon, that was the role that really orchestrated the conversations, picked what was discussed. But this I think she took it kind of a step further with the climate she was in. This wasn't just a salon hosted in a city that wasn't currently having the intense evolution that Philadelphia was having.
Sure. Yeah. And she herself recalls much later in the 19th century that I will remember to have frequently associated with the most respectable, influential members of that convention that framed the Constitution, and that all important subject was frequently discussed at our house. So this was really, her way of using her domestic sphere to really imprint her influences on the budding republic. And this was the opportunity to use what was afforded to her as a woman in a way to influence the new country.
Yeah, and it kind of would have been, it's the domestic sphere, but it's her own public. It was her public world. It wasn't, she got things done in it, which is very interesting. And then the whole idea of the Constitution being discussed there, since she was such an active participant in these conversations, since these people did take her seriously, it's a big claim, but I like to imagine that some of her ideas helped these men write the Constitution, and really that her ideas just are within so much of what the founding of the Republic. So, and there is a tangible example of that with our good friend George Washington, who often attended these salons, including during the Constitutional Convention. Yeah.
So that brings us to
George
none
Washington. So my chapter for the upcoming book is framed around George and Elizabeth's friendship, with putting Elizabeth in Philadelphia as a whole. It's not just who she was in relation to George, but the two of them, their friendship is really a great example of her reputation, her intelligence, how people took her seriously within Philadelphia, and how she was able to build her own network. And the kind of peak of that is being friends with the President of the United States.
Absolutely.
But I do really briefly want to mention, so they as far as their friendship goes, they met in the 1770s. They became friends in the 1780s, and then they stayed friends throughout their life. But these two portraits that we have on here, both have really interesting stories. I'll briefly talk about them. The portrait on the right is George Washington by an artist named Joseph Wright. And actually, that image is the exact portrait, the copy that the Powells owned. So at some point in the 1780s, they either commissioned the portrait, they were given the portrait. The exact story isn't clear, but it's really cool to imagine that Elizabeth had this portrait. She had this portrait in her last house that she lived in. There's a great anecdote, which I won't go into right now, talking about how that portrait was in a public place. So she very much was proud of her relationship with Washington and wanted to show that she was friends with him and he was friends with her. But the portrait on the left, I really do want to mention. This is a newly acquired portrait for the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. It is a beautiful portrait of Elizabeth Powell, painted circa 1793. Also by the artist Joseph Wright. There's been some scholarship on this done by one of our curators, and that's the conclusion that has been come to, and there's more to do, of course, research-wise, but it's a beautiful portrait. It's unfinished. We think that might have been because Joseph Wright died in the yellow fever. And the portrait, Kayla and I were talking about this, and Kayla mentioned prior to this how we talked about how this was maybe commissioned for her 50th birthday because she turned 50 in 1793. So the party itself was very lavish and there were poems and things, but it was a big deal. It was a big anniversary. And it's just a beautiful portrait. And really it provides a snapshot
into who she looked like, who she was when she had this relationship with Washington.
Yep.
And what's also really special about this, and for all the library company viewers, you are getting the debut of this portrait.
Yes.
So no one else has seen this before. Except for me, I have seen it.
Yes.
But this is a newly acquired portrait from Mount Vernon, and it's a really nice little eclipse into her later life. When she was really, really influential.
Yep, at the peak, and it's kind of exactly what she looked like when she wrote the letter that I'm going to briefly talk about next.
Yes.
This is the big letter. So this is the letter that I first got to know Elizabeth Powell through, with the whole birthday thing. But this letter, this is one of many letters that she wrote to George Washington, but this is by far the most tangible, obvious example of their deep friendship with one another and her influence on him and her influence on changing the route of the country. She knew what she was doing when she wrote this letter. So she had a discussion with George Washington the day before the start of the election process, so on November 1st, 1792, and he expressed to her that he was considering not running a second term as president. And this was not the first time he mentioned this. He had started discussing it months prior, and the cool thing is that the only other people he seemed to discuss it with, at least that's documented, are members of his cabinet. So she was the only woman and the only friend that he discussed this with. So that really shows how he viewed her. He almost viewed her, I think, as a member of his cabinet. And so this letter, after the conversation, we like to think it might have happened in this room. She sat down and wrote an 8-page letter full of reasons why he should not run for president again, or why he should run for president again. And so it's very dramatic, very long, but it's just very interesting because she's friends with him and she's doing this for him, but she's also doing it for the welfare of our common country. And at the end of the first page, she says that the this letter, if she didn't write it, it would be inconsistent with my friendship for you to withhold. So
there, we're hearing from her own mouth that it would not be normal for her to hold her tongue on such a subject that is so near and dear to her heart.
Yes.
And you can see that obviously they had a very close relationship for her to feel comfortable enough to say such a thing.
Yes. And then I did want to include a letter from after he did accept the presidency. He wrote to a friend that it was not an easy decision, and he still didn't necessarily want to take it. But he said, as my particular and confidential friends well know, that it was after a long and painful conflict in my own breast that I decided to do this again. And I like to think of the parallel between inconsistent with my friendship for you and then my particular and confidential friends well know.
Yes.
So she was clearly one of his particular and confidential friends.
Absolutely. But this is, like you said, Sam, pretty much the pinnacle of her political influence in Philadelphia. But she moves on, much later in her life to continue to influence future generations of Philadelphians and to make an impact in Philadelphia.
Yes.
So Samuel dies in 1798 of the yellow fever epidemic.
1793.
Yeah. 1793. Thank you. The other one was 1798. And
Sorry.
1793. And unfortunately, they don't have any children. So all of their children died in infancy. And this isn't an ending for Elizabeth, though. And that's what we've really discovered in these account books, is that she's still buying china and silver and furniture, food. She does leave behind this house on 3rd Street, though. So she moves and she breaks ground on a new house on Chestnut Street.
Yes.
Which we have a lovely print and view from the library company as well, about this house on Chestnut Street, which Sam actually discovered. So feel free to chime in on this. But part of it is Elizabeth's house. It's not actually the whole thing. Is not her house. But she moves on, started a new chapter of her life, and does this as a single widowed woman. She takes on the account books of Samuel's right away. She picks them up within 2 months of his death, and she starts to continue to manage the property and the real estate and collecting up the rents. One of which was the City Tavern.
Yes.
So
which we walked by earlier.
But this image is really a striking, very cool image. It's a little bit later than Elizabeth's life, but you get a kind of a feel for how busy the Chestnut Street area was at that time.
Yes.
And she was absolutely still entertaining, which is not only proved in her account books, but also in this clipping from the National Gazette, where it states how she entertained the Marquis de Lafayette when he came back into the city for his grand tour and return. And after the ball, he went over to Powell's with a select circle of ladies and gentlemen. So clearly it was noteworthy enough.
To be put in the paper.
And that is where he went after his honorary
that he chose
ball.
to go to her, and that was actually 6 years before she died. So this was much later in her life. And we did include a couple of other quotes, actually both from Adam's family members. So one kind of cool example of young people coming to see her and seeking her out is a couple of letters from Louisa Adams from 1822 when she was in Philadelphia. She writes to both John Quincy Adams and John Adams about going to visit Elizabeth, and she says she's one of her favorites, and she also calls her an antique above all price, which is not in this, but I love that. But she describes the feel of what was going on at Elizabeth's at that time, what an event would have been like there. It would have been more subdued. It would have been this was a tea that they were taking, but it would have been good conversation. Her conversations were delightful and full of anecdote and polished by reading, as we've talked about multiple times, and to which she has been much devoted. And she looks and acts like a duchess, which I love. But then the other thing that we wanted to include on here was that even though people couldn't come back to see her, they reflected on their time with her, which is
she was a stage.
Yes. So this little quote from John Adams actually is from a reply to a letter from Louisa, where she says she wishes that he and Mrs. Powell could be together again because their reminiscences would be delightful. So he does write a funny thing about how if he could run about Philadelphia as he did 48 years ago, he would now visit Mrs. Powell before anything, and that he loves her now as well as he once did. And he toasted her at a party with some sort of compliment that he,
in the presence of Samuel, who apparently took it very well.
Yes,
But it is funny because he later goes on to say, although she didn't like me very well,
I liked her.
I really liked her. So it's clear that, you know, she really had a lasting impact on everybody in this generation and in the next. So the person that she probably had the largest influence on was her nephew, John Hare Powell. And this is a portrait of him by Sir Thomas Lawrence.
When he was in England.
Yes, when he was in England, which
she sent him on the tour.
Exactly.
Yeah. So John Hare Powell, we wanted to talk about him because he really was kind of he was very much her focus in her family. She influenced so many people, but John Hare Powell was kind of her favorite, I think, or I would say he was her favorite. And he was the last of her nieces and nephews to be born. He was born in 1786, and she really took a liking to him right away. She had lost all of her sons and a daughter, but she took him in and really decided that he was going to be the one that she would spend the most care with. She made sure he had the best education. She started corresponding with him frequently. Grooming him to become very much the next upstanding citizen of the United States. And she sent him on a tour of Europe when he was 19. And there's some very funny correspondence between them at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. And it's a good example of how her wanting to educate her nieces and nephews and family members, how it did and did not work, I guess, or did work, but how it was received by the individuals. So this is a fun example where she had written to him telling him that he needed to work on his handwriting, and it was not very good, and she couldn't read it, and she wanted to read his letters, but she couldn't.
In fact, she
even tries to
translate.
Yes, so you can
his letters.
Yes, you can see above scratched, it says in tiny little handwriting, scratched. But we won't read you the whole quote because it's long, but this is just an interesting example of how one descendant or one ancestor, like nephew of hers.
Yeah. Oh, unhappy youth. I've had an aunt who after 23 years could not make thee a gentleman. And then he just goes on and on. And it's very dramatic, but it's very sweet and cute because they both sort of have this like very jovial, playful rapport with one another, where they just sort of tease each other, but she is still trying to teach him and get him to be a respectable citizen. And it's really sweet just to look at as an example of like how much he really cared for her and he for her as well, which I think is really beautifully outlined in the next quote that we have, that he's writing to his
sister. There's sets and sets. There's all different letters at HSP, but this is one. He's very silly with his aunt, but he does multiple times. This is only one of many times where he talks about how much he loves her, how much gratitude and affection he has towards her, to the best aunt that certainly ever lived, which I love. And he says that a lot. So that's just a nice, even though they were interacting so silly and he was so silly back to her, he clearly cared and appreciated the attention.
And in fact, he actually also changed his name from John Powell Hare to John Hare Powell in order to inherit the Powell fortune. And so he was absolutely her favorite nephew. And like, as we've mentioned, we've had some lovely descendants who have loaned items to us and donated to Mount Vernon, and they are actually all descendants of John Hare Powell. So he has a soft spot, I think, in our organization as well. But it wasn't only family members that she was influencing. She had a broad influence among the different founding fathers' relations as well. And Washington is probably like the best example of that because they have a really fun silly relationship as well, and maintained it for quite a number of years
until his death. They met in 1783, and they were consistently seeing each other until 1829 when he died, or around 1829. They were seeing each other, but this Bushrod Washington is an example of an early period when she was trying to start really making these young men and women into good citizens. He met Elizabeth through his aunt and uncle, his uncle really, and it was a great connection for him because the Powells really represented the social epicenter. So by knowing them, he could get his own foot in the door. Right. But they really took a liking to him, especially Elizabeth. There's several letters from Bushrod to his mother. And this is only one anecdote of several, but he really just kind of adored her and adored the education she gave him. And she was very funny with him. And in this example, she called him out on every foible which she discovered, and from thence takes the opportunity of correcting them. So in this example, she gives him a watch string because she didn't like the one he was wearing.
Yeah. So it wasn't good enough for him for some reason.
Yeah. So she told him to wear it in front of her.
So surprised him with a new watch.
Yeah.
But it's just a very sweet, again, kind of picture. She didn't have children of her own, but she really was able to have a strong influence on a lot of different people's lives.
Yes.
And Bushrod's a great example of that too.
So for the last bit, we want to talk about her influence on the city, or her legacy within Philadelphia. So as we've talked about, when she moved from her 3rd Street residence, she did not stop being involved in politics, being involved in city affairs. She really was an active player until the end of her life. And that did not only include influencing people and interacting with people, it was also building up the city of Philadelphia.
Right.
And
she was supporting a lot of different organizations in Philadelphia. And these are actually all from the account books that we have here at Phil Landmarks. So from later in her life, but she was supporting a lot of children's organizations and women's organizations.
Yep.
So the one on the top there is from 1813 is a subscription to the Female Association for the Relief and Employment of the Poor. The one in the center there from 1816 gave Miss Abercrombie and Miss Rush $30 in gold for the use of the Orphan Society of Philadelphia. And the one at the bottom, in 1818, she purchased books for St. Peter's Sunday School, which we were researching as well, which were much more secular than they were
really reading and teaching children how to read. So she was giving money for the books to educate these children, which is very interesting.
It's very much a through line throughout her entire
throughout her life.
But she was trying to, absolutely contribute and build up the city of Philadelphia as well. Probably the most notable contribution she made was to the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. And this is really cool. You should talk about it, Sam, because you found it. But it's in her will.
Yes. And the Powells did have at least four enslaved individuals in their home within the 1770s. By 1790, in the 1790 census, they're not listed as having any slaves in their household. So they either manumitted the slaves throughout the enslaved people throughout the 1780s, or began hiring them on as paid servants. But that affected her, and her opinions evolved over time, as many people's did. But the best example of this and how her opinion changed is in her will. She donates $100 a year for 20 years to the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, because, as you can see in the quote, she abhorred slavery under any circumstance and considered the practice of holding our fellow creatures in bondage alike inconsistent with the principles of humanity and the free republican institutions of our country. So this was a big deal, and the clipping on the left is the minutes from this society, and they copied her will into that.
Which is really great, because they outline, we're going to transcribe the beginning of this part of the will.
Yes.
Which is pretty neat.
And it's also in the obituary. So it not only was in her will, which would have been read to her family, but it was published in her very long and detailed obituary. So it was made very public and very clear, her thoughts on it, and whether or not that was a request from her or one of her nieces or nephews who wrote the obituary. It's not clear, but it's really cool that is in her obituary. And yeah, so this is just kind of the final example of her life.
Yeah.
So
and as you mentioned at the beginning, she lived to be she died in 1830, so she lived to be about 87.
Yeah.
So she had a very long life, but she was obviously highly esteemed from all who knew her. And we just thought it was so fitting to end on this quote from Louisa Adams to John Adams. Her mind is as vigorous as ever, and she loves to talk over times past when active memory retraces pleasures long gone by and still fills her vivid fancy with actors and scenes in which she's shown a bright
brilliant constellation. It's
so,
one of the best quotes.
Yeah, so it's clear that, she was quite, a figure in Philadelphia, and really, really well admired and liked, and yeah. Really all I have there.
Yes. So thank you for letting us talk about this. Yes, and we're looking forward to questions.
Yeah.
Thank you both. That was wonderful. You're welcome to stop sharing your screen so we can go back into a more conversational mode. We already have a number of questions here for you. Which is great, and they're super specific questions that I would have no idea how to answer, so I'm very eager to see how you do with them.
Throw them at us.
Yeah, just to sort of situate this in like the current moment, we're thinking a lot about infectious disease right now, and I was thinking about that image of her in 1793 at the age of 50, which also happened to be 1793, the year that she loses her husband.
Yep.
How do her salons change in that context?
Well,
or do we have a sense of how they change?
Yes. So she does go into a period of mourning, but pretty quickly you start seeing in her papers that people are talking about going to her house, going to dinners. John Adams mentions that he writes to Abigail that he has recently gone to Elizabeth's house and she's much afflicted, but she's still hosting these dinners. It doesn't seem like she had quite the passion may not have been there right away again. It doesn't sound like it was as consistent as it was before, but she does start hosting things again. She does not go to as many events. That's at least what people have said in their letters, but she was still very active.
And so just to anticipate a question that just came up, she stayed in Philadelphia during the yellow fever epidemic.
No, she went to her brother's estate. Samuel stayed in Philadelphia. He went to her brother's house and visited for a day, and then actually went back into the city, and he contracted yellow fever and died on their farmland.
Yeah, I mean, so it sounded like he was really did not want to leave the city. I mean, he of course held a public office, and he felt that he needed to be here to do business. So she did flee, but he unfortunately did not. And then eventually he died in Powelton Village. If you're familiar with
if you're familiar with Powelton, that is named after the Powells. That's what they called their land. Their country estate.
So David Maxey is going to bring us some attention to their relationship. And he asked, do you think that Elizabeth Powell and Samuel Powell knew each other before Samuel returned from Great Britain? And do you feel that their marriage was a matter of convenience rather than some kind of deep romantic engagement?
I don't think that it was, I don't think it was a marriage of convenience. I really don't. There's some very interesting letters that are her private observations on him and on their relationship, and they're very genuine. Of course, they both were good standing political, powerful people. So yes, it would have been a powerful match, but I don't know if they met before he left for Europe when he went to Great Britain and Italy. Unfortunately, the records don't survive. But
you did mention, so we were actually talking about this over dinner tonight, and she brought up like this really amazing transcription in a Bible that is at HSP that Elizabeth wrote on the death of Samuel, and it is quite moving.
Intense.
It's very, it's clear how much she loved him.
It was not.
Maybe it wasn't an initial match of love, but it certainly
developed into it.
David Kozlow asks, have you found any evidence, be they letters, journals, etc., demonstrating that Powell had connections with Hilary Baker, who was the mayor of Philadelphia in 1796 and 1797? He died of the yellow fever in 1798 because unlike wealthy residents of the city, he remained in Philly during the epidemic to give assistance.
I have gone through all of her letters at this point. and there's not a lot that survived from the 1790s after, which is so difficult because and I've not seen that name, but it would be interesting to look into and see if I happen to come across it. She was, there's a few letters talking about her from that period, but no one by that name is mentioned. She may have known him. She knew so many people, but there's no specific mention of any interaction with the two of them. So.
Denise Bachlan asks, who was living in the Powell house during the 9-month British occupation during the American Revolution? What condition was the mansion in after the war?
Well, the Powells were.
The Powells were living there. Yeah, they stayed.
Living here, so they stayed. So Samuel, he actually signs the Oath of Allegiance right before the British leave.
Pretty late.
Philadelphia. And the house actually is occupied by the Earl of Carlisle, but they don't kick the Powells out. They just kick them to servants' quarters. So they ended up having to stay in the back of the house, and what is an addition here today. Yeah. So it's an interesting story, really, because they're very politically savvy, and they held their cards close to them. So they were able to sort of play both sides and
play it well.
They were. And the Earl of Carlisle writes that, they are almost the best of friends and they take tea every day. Meanwhile, a few weeks before Samuel signs the Oath of Allegiance to the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So they're living with that secret, which I think that maybe, we don't talk about that enough, but I think it's a really fascinating angle that this is treason. This is, you're going against the British crown here, and you're a British citizen, and you've done this, and now you have a British officer living in your home, who you're
cordial with.
So it's quite an accomplishment on that.
But as far as the state of the mansion, as far as we know, there was nothing that was hurt. Nothing happened.
They were, unfortunately, because of their position in Philadelphia, I think they were not treated poorly or targeted.
Yeah.
So I've got 2 questions about Samuel Powell, one from August Widmeyer and the other from William Jordan, both asking sort of along the same lines. Wasn't he once the mayor of Philadelphia?
Yes, I guess we didn't even bring that up. He was.
This was Elizabeth's show. He was the mayor of Philadelphia under the British Crown, the last mayor of Philadelphia under the British Crown, and the first mayor of Philadelphia in the New Republic.
Yes.
So he was able to continue his title
in the new country. And he became Speaker of the Pennsylvania Senate after he turned down another term as mayor. So yes, he was indeed the mayor of Philadelphia.
Thank you for pointing that out.
David Maxey mentions that the Joseph Wright portrait is fascinating because it's a portrait of Elizabeth Powell that shows her age in 1793, much more than the Pratt portrait whose dating absorbed me, and which is often given the erroneous, I argued, date of 1793. What do you think about the date of the Pratt portrait that hangs in the Powell house, as you just showed, on loan from PAFA?
So scholarship on that has dated it a little earlier than 1793, just based upon the age of the portrait that Mount Vernon has recently received. And so it's starting to be that we think it's around 1780, not 1793.
Got it.
Yep.
Excellent. David Coslow asked, did Powell give money to the Quaker school that educated both Black and white children?
I know that she did to several schools. Free schools. So I'm not sure if that was, that term is not, I think, what we think of it as, but she did send one of her indentured servants to one of the schools that was run by the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, the Clarkson School, I believe is what it was called. So that there's so many financial records. I would like to continue to go through them and make sure I figure out what exactly it was. So to be determined.
Martha King asked, did Elizabeth Powell have any suitors after Samuel's death?
Well, Martha, thanks for asking that.
This is new.
A
little bit.
So she, yes and no. there's an odd letter that is written in 1797 by two kind of gossipy girls who live in Delaware, Cadwallader and Ridgely. So that's their last names. But they're talking about Elizabeth making an appearance at George Washington's last birthnight ball. And they say that she looked elegant, she was wearing a black velvet dress, but they talk about how she's not married anymore, so she could go to more things if she wanted to, but she doesn't, and that she would not marry anyone under a Washington. But they also bring up someone mentioned a Major Butler. And so Major Butler was Pierce Butler, who was one of the senators from South Carolina, I believe, which Martha, you might know that actually, and because of Katie Green. But Pierce Butler, so there's nothing else really besides that. I did recently actually just find a letter from Pierce Butler from 1792 to her. There's also a couple of poems that mention him. So that's the only like concrete evidence, I guess I would say, that she had any type of suitor.
But I mean, the reason I think she stayed a widow was just she didn't have to. She didn't have to get married.
Yeah.
I mean, she was in a really solid financial position, and from what we think about her relationship with
really
Samuel,
did.
I don't know that she would have even been. And she was much older at that point as well, too.
Well, yes.
So,
yes. But
there might have been something.
There was the one Pierce Butler thing.
Mitchell Kramer asks if you could talk at all about her relationship with Martha Washington.
Yes. I always feel bad because I do tend to leave out Martha, and I don't mean to do that. They also had a great relationship. They really bonded over the Custis grandchildren. I don't know how familiar you are with Martha, but and their family, but they Martha and George had basically adopted two of Martha's grandchildren, and they lived with them during the presidency and throughout the period between the presidency and the war. But Martha and Elizabeth really bonded over that. They bonded over kind of teaching them how to be upright citizens, like we've talked about. But they also, they seem to enjoy conversation. They have some letters back and forth to each other. It's not the same level of emotional connection as her in Washington, but yeah, they definitely also had a relationship too.
So we're running out of time, which I feel terrible about because we still have like 7 outstanding questions.
Oh, yeah, like go quick. We'll answer them all.
All right. Lightning round. All right. First off, who has the largest treasure trove of Powell-related correspondence?
Oh my, HSP, hands down, and library company. They're a combination, but unless there's some secret library out there, the HSP and library company have the most. But they're spread out in so many places. University of Indiana, Delaware, Yale. There's letters everywhere, but the main bulk is HSP and library company.
All right, so now from letters to monographs. Sarah Watson asks, first, she thanks you for this wonderful talk. And then she says,
thank you, Sarah, for watching.
I would love to hear more about Elizabeth's books. Do you have a sense of what types of things she was reading? Did she own novels, political texts, religious books?
All sorts. She was reading anything from The British Spy, which was a fiction novel that mentioned her brother-in-law, William Byrd, which I do have to make a shameless plug. A good friend of mine is writing a biography on Mary Willingbird, so you'll have to check that out when it comes out. Amy flew grad to Quiche. But she was also reading David Hume, Rousseau. She was reading History of the Roman Empire. She was reading
encyclopedias.
Yeah, encyclopedias. She purchased. She continued on the encyclopedia run just after Samuel died. She buys the next 2 volumes of the encyclopedia. So really, just about anything she could get her hands on, I think she was reading.
Wollstonecraft.
Mary Wollstonecraft. Not a huge fan. But that's a longer conversation.
All right, I'm going to give the last question of the evening to Charles Keats, who asks, are there any examples of direct correspondence between Benjamin Franklin and Elizabeth Powell?
Yes, there is. There is a letter at the American Philosophical Society from Elizabeth Powell to Benjamin Franklin, 1780. 88. And it's not a very long letter, but she thanks him for loaning her his carriage for a man from Virginia who was ill and needed the carriage. And she thanks him and of course says, I hope you are well on this fine day, dear Dr. Franklin, or something very sweet. So yes.
Lovely. Well, thank you everyone who asked great questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to everybody, but thanks most of all, Kayla, Sam, this was wonderful. I really enjoy all of the enthusiasm and expertise you brought to this.
Thank you so much for having us, Will. And thank you to the library company too. It's a pleasure to be here to support.
And if anybody has more questions, feel free to reach out. Will, you can share my email if you want, and visit Powell House. It is beautiful and it's a real treat. So, and it's been a wonderful time being here.
Well, thank you both. For everybody else who's tuning in, next week we're taking a week off. We're going to postpone Daniel Sheehan's book preview, but we'll be meeting in 2 weeks from today with Cameron Segelius, who's going to be talking about slave revolt and the practices of containment. So I hope you'll all join us then. Until then, have a great evening. Take care of yourselves, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Bye.